There's just a list of places in Britain which were fluoridated, as I've mentioned already, Birmingham and other parts of the West Midlands back in 1964. Newcastle was the other big scheme up in the northeast of England. Scunthorpe in North Lincolnshire actually, but quite close to Yorkshire, 1968. You can see the other places, Workington. Huddersfield's in Yorkshire, Dewsbury also Yorkshire, parts of Lincolnshire, Grimsby in Lincolnshire, Oxford, Bedfordshire and Crewe. Some of those are still working, others, rather like the Watford scheme, fell by the wayside. What was interesting is that up to 1974, and I'll talk about the legal basis for fluoridation in the UK, up to 1974 it was the local authorities, the local councils, which made the decisions about water fluoridation. And Birmingham and Newcastle, and maybe some of the others, I don't know, this was the days before the nationalisation and then the privatisation of the water supply. They were owned by the local authorities, a lot of the big ones, like Birmingham and Newcastle. The city council owned the water supply. So when Birmingham City Council Health Committee, and then endorsed by the full council, said we want to have water fluoridation in Birmingham and have the benefits of water fluoridation for our children, they didn't have to go to a water company or even a nationalised water industry and say, oh please sir, could we have water fluoridation? They decided they want it, so they did it. And they owned the water company, or they were the water undertaker, and just got on and did it. So it was much easier in those days, and we'll come on to the legal basis later. That's what happened in Birmingham. In Birmingham, the bright green and Dudley, as I've mentioned, not fluoridated. In 1967, water fluoridation actually started in 1964, but they had problems with the waterworks. It was one of the early ones. They had problems, and it wasn't running consistently at 1 part per million until 1965. I didn't move to Birmingham after I graduated till 1967. So it wasn't a true baseline, but looking at 5-year-old children, they wouldn't have had so much of the benefit between 1965 and early 1967 when I saw them. And you can see Birmingham and Dudley, same level of caries. By 1970, the 5-year-old children had had fluoride for about 5 years, a bit less, but about 5 years. And you can see that 50% reduction. And in the 1970s, the toothpaste manufacturers had carried out their trials on fluoride toothpastes, which were new in those days. We tend to think all toothpastes have always had fluoride. Well, they haven't. If you look back at the early 1970s, that was the time when the trials were first being carried out to see if putting fluoride into toothpastes was effective. But by the mid-1970s, the studies on toothpaste had been published, that all the big manufacturers were then putting fluoride into their toothpastes, and you can see Dudley had had some benefit. The caries level in the Dudley children had gone down, but the children in Birmingham had had more benefit because they had fluoride from the water supply and from the toothpaste. So when anti-fluoridationists say, well, you can have fluoride in your toothpaste if you want it, you don't have to put it in the water, we need to be saying to them, wait a minute, actually if you have it in the water and the toothpaste, you get a much greater level of benefit. Similar sort of study carried out in Newcastle. They didn't have a baseline survey, unfortunately, but 1976 they had very much like the Birmingham Dudley situation of 5 years or more of fluoridation. 1981, you can see, and the The area in Northumberland, the blue area, it had gone down because of the fluoride toothpastes, but further benefits to the children in Newcastle. And after that, the next survey was in 1987. Basically, no change in either of those areas. It fluctuates slightly anyhow, but no great change in the level of caries. And I've talked about, we understand what DMFT is. And I talked about talking to politicians, how you might use the number of extractions which are necessary, but we can sometimes demonstrate DMFT diagrammatically, which makes it more easily understandable to politicians. So here we have Kirklees, which is basically Huddersfield in Yorkshire, a bit north of here, and part of Birmingham East and North. And rather than using DMFT per child, it's sometimes easier to talk about the number of teeth affected per 100 children. And you can see there, 227 teeth per 100 children. So a DMFT of 2.27, but it's easier perhaps for a layperson, instead of talking to them about 0.27 of a tooth, to talk about number of teeth per 100 children. Half that level amongst the children in Birmingham. And I mentioned trying to find other ways of describing it to politicians. In Newcastle, they asked the children, or the parents of the children, have you ever suffered from toothache? And you can see the difference in Northumberland, non-fluoridated, Newcastle, fluoridated. Fewer children suffering from toothache. Fewer children having to go for extractions. And more recently, looking at the tooth extractions carried out under general anaesthetics in non-fluoridated West Yorkshire and fluoridated Birmingham, West Yorkshire in red, Birmingham in turquoise, 2001-2 and then 2002-3, you can see both of those years, the difference in the number of children who'd had teeth extracted, or the number of teeth extracted in those two areas. And that's presenting the same sort of thing in a slightly different way, rather than using bar charts, using diagrams to try and communicate what that actually means in terms of if the politicians can sort of read the pictures, the surgeon dressed up for the GA. Now, I said that dental caries is linked to deprivation, and I was talking about Hartlepool. If you go to northwest Surrey, down in southeast England, affluent area, over the period of those Bascod surveys, you can see that the DMFT was round about 1. And in fact, at the time, the government had set a target, saying that by the year 2000, that's why this particular graph, this series of bar charts, ends in 1999. By the year 2000, said the government, our target is that the average 5-year-old child should have no more than 1 decayed, missing and filled tooth. Well, they were there, right, certainly from the mid-1980s, down in the leafy suburbs of northwest Surrey. Yeah.
Isn't that the same target by WHO for the year 2000 for 12 years old, the MFT? The DMFT of
that's for 12-year-olds. Yeah, absolutely.
But you had it for 5 years. That
we had a UK target of a little DMFT, primary teeth, of 1 for 5-year-olds.
So you'll be like 7 years before other parts of the world. You will have less caries in the primary teeth.
Yeah.
That will prevent it more in the permanent teeth.
Well, you hope that it's going to be less in the permanent teeth as well, yes. I might come on actually to pick up the point. There's quite an important point actually. In fact, I'll do it now. you remember when we were looking at one of the other studies that the greatest effect was on the smooth surfaces and not on the occlusal surfaces. At the age of 12, most caries is occlusal.
Yes.
There is, of course, interstitial caries and there is smooth surface caries. But most caries is occlusal in the pits and fissures. And fluoride has less effect there. So actually some of the studies which have looked at the effectiveness of water fluoridation in children of 12 have not shown such a benefit as looking at older children when there is more interstitial and smooth surface caries than younger children. So it's quite important to actually look at the age of the population you're comparing to see if caries is likely to have occurred on the smooth surfaces which might have been prevented by fluoride. So, northwest Surrey, they're there. Leeds, where I was working during that period of time, you can see it was round about twice as much. And so when I was talking to the politicians in Leeds, I was able to show them the difference in the leafy suburbs of the southeast and more deprived areas in the north of England. Sandwell is in the West Midlands, one of the most deprived areas in the country. It's the area of West Bromwich, which you may or may not have heard about, but a very deprived area in the West Midlands. In 1985, they had a caries level very similar to that in Leeds, and Sheffield has always been slightly better than Leeds, and I've never discovered quite why it's better. It's not fluoridated, apart from a little bit actually in the south of the city, but generally Sheffield is not fluoridated. Its level of deprivation is not that different from Leeds, but it has slightly better, not vastly better, but slightly better dental health than Leeds. So there we are. Perhaps John Green, who used to be the consultant in dental public health in Sheffield, was doing something better than I was doing up in Leeds when I was working there. But there we go. So in 1985, Sandwell was about the same level as Leeds, and then their water was fluoridated. And I was working in Birmingham, not by then, but shortly before then. I was what was then known as the area dental officer for the city of Birmingham. And Birmingham was fluoridated, and areas like Dudley and Sandwell were pushing to have water fluoridation so that they could get the benefits too. And as you can see, by 1985 they actually achieved it. And there was one bit of Birmingham which wasn't fluoridated, and that was the leafy suburb of North Birmingham, a place called Sutton Coldfield. And so what I said when people asked me, well, actually probably the children in Sutton Coldfield don't particularly need it. They've already got pretty good dental health. But I do support my colleagues working in Sandwell and Wolverhampton and Dudley because the children there desperately need it. So I was supporting those elsewhere. And I mentioned Birmingham and Dudley. Interestingly enough, one of the areas that I surveyed in Birmingham was a place called Balsall Heath, a very deprived inner city area. And one of the other areas outside the fluoridated area was the one I've just mentioned, Sutton Coldfield. And a bit like Hartlepool really, dental health was the single health indicator where the children in Balsall Heath were better off than the children in Sutton Coldfield. It really does. And sometimes fluoridation has been described as giving poor kids rich kids' teeth, which is quite a nice way of talking about the social inequalities and how fluoridation helps with that. So, Sandwell fluoridated in 1986, and you can see amongst 5-year-old children how over a period of time, as they'd had more exposure to fluoride over their 5-year lives, then so the DMFT came down until after 1991, when they'd had it all their life, they were showing that 50% reduction. Now, I talked about Ayr and Kilmarnock. I thought there was a slide coming up. There we are, 1956, at the beginning of the trial. Very similar to MFT. Ayr, the blue turquoisey colour. Kilmarnock, not fluoridated, in 1956, green. Kilmarnock was then fluoridated, yellow. 5 years later, there's that 50% reduction. 1963, when Professor Mansbridge went back, still essentially the same. Then the mayor died and the fluoridation stopped, and Kilmarnock was then not fluoridated. 5 years on, back to the level of Ayr. Those 5-year-old children had never received fluoridated water and received none of the benefits. There's the social class difference I've been talking about. Social class 1 and 2, professional and managerial people. The red without fluoridation. So the red, social class 1 and 2, that's the amount of tooth decay. Red, social class 3, skilled manual workers, more caries. Bigger red bar. Social class 4-5, non-fluoridated, red, semi-skilled and unskilled manual workers, more caries. But then looking at the fluoridated area, social class 1 and 2, they're half the level. And again in the two other social groups. And you can see essentially giving poor kids, rich kids teeth. If you compare social class 3, 4 and 5, fluoridated, with the unfluoridated social class 1, they're about the same. A lot of the studies have been carried out on primary teeth in 5-year-olds. If you go much older than 5, you're starting to lose some of the teeth. So 5-year-olds is actually quite a good age to study. But looking at 14-year-olds, where you're getting a bit more of some interstitial caries and smooth surface caries, you can see fluoridated Birmingham, and in this case non-fluoridated Bolton over on the other side of the Pennines. Same sort of picture in the permanent teeth of older children. And looking not just at main DMFTs, but this time looking at those who've got a lot of caries, those who've got 5 or more decayed permanent teeth. Again, you can see the difference between fluoridated Birmingham and non-fluoridated Bolton. Adults, I said, I think it is really more and more important that we don't just talk about children, but we talk about adults. This was a nice study and is one of the very few blind studies, and it was carried out in the area of the county of Gwynedd in northwest Wales. Anglesey was still fluoridated in 1991, and the mainland was not fluoridated. And women who were having babies had to go to the hospital, the maternity hospital, which was on the mainland. So Professor Jackson from Leeds University went and he set up his dental survey in the maternity hospital on the mainland, and he saw all the women that came through the hospital. Some of them lived, grown up on the mainland, some of them had grown up and lived on the island of Anglesey. So some of them had had non-fluoridated water, and some of them had had fluoridated water. He didn't know, for each woman coming through, what her address was. He didn't know whether she lived on one side of the bridge or the other side of the bridge. And it wasn't until after he'd done all the examinations that he was allowed. In fact, the person who held the key, he did it twice. In fact, the person who held the key on one occasion was a bishop, and the person who held the key on the other occasion was a lawyer, on the grounds that one hopes that bishops and lawyers are trustworthy and won't let on whether the women are from the mainland or from the island, and I'm sure they didn't. So he didn't know when he did the examinations whether they were fluoridated or non-fluoridated, but you can see there was an obvious benefit for those who lived on the fluoridated island compared with those who lived on the non-fluoridated mainland. And looking at even older groups, adults in fluoridated areas keep more of their own teeth. So we've got the percentage of adults with 20 or more natural teeth in fluoridated red, in green, and non-fluoridated in red. And you can see in both groups, as people got older, more of them had not got 20 of their own teeth left, but considerably more at each age group had more of their own teeth in the fluoridated area. And another study, this one carried out in Canada, Stratford non-fluoridated, Woodstock fluoridated, similar sort of pattern in adults over the age of 60, and this is picking up the root caries situation, benefits in both men and women of water fluoridation in preventing root caries in over 60-year-olds. And 5 years ago or so now, 6 years, Griffin in the States did a systematic review looking at the published studies on adult dental health, and found 7 studies which met the criteria, good studies, well presented, well carried out, well presented, and she looked at the results and found overall a 35% reduction. So 50% in children, 35% in adults. Have to say in children, 50% is probably a bit optimistic now. If you look at the results in the States, where 75% of the water supplies are now fluoridated, you won't find a 50% difference between fluoridated areas and non-fluoridated areas. The reason is that most of the big cities in the States are fluoridated, and most of the food and drink processing plants are in the big cities, so that the fluoridated water is used for making the drinks which go into the cans, go all over the country, and into the cooking of the foodstuffs in processed foods, which go all over the country. So actually people living in non-fluoridated parts of the States, which is only about 25% of the population, are getting some of the benefits of fluoridation through drinking drinks and foods which have come from fluoridated areas. So we can't now demonstrate, usually anyhow, a 50% reduction in such areas.